Now, this story is much bigger than the headline. This is a systematic failure. KHA, or the Killeen Housing Authority, managed over 50 residential units for low-income, elderly, and disabled students. HUD funding supports rent subsidies, which helps extremely low-income families afford stable housing, emergency housing, which provides short-term placement for families experiencing crises or displacement, and even senior and disabled services that supports the residents who rely on the fixed incomes of the government or government assistance, and the maintenance and property upkeep that ensures housing units remain safe, sanitary, and habitable. HUD's national budget is over 70 billion. Section 8 alone supports 2.3 million households. Killeen's vulnerable families depend on these systems. When the funds vanish, entire communities suffer. So what was Deidre Johnson's role? Johnson was an executive director with control over contracts, vendor payments, financial approvals, and federal housing funds. She left KHA in 2022 and was hired by the city of Austin for another housing role. She was indicted on 9 theft charges and 1 false statement charge. Investigators identified long-term misuse of funds she pled guilty to in 2025 and received 37 months in prison, as well as paying some fees back. So how did this fraud work? Johnson used HUD funds for personal rent and utilities. She used taxpayer-funded housing dollars to cover her own household expenses. This includes furniture and home goods. Money meant for replacing broken appliances in public housing was used to furnish her home. She used funds for her car maintenance, loans, even purchased a new vehicle. Investigators found evidence of luxury flights founded by HUD money. And there was even payments benefiting family members. Some of the transfers directly supported relatives. So, what kickback schemes did she use? She used falsified invoices, shell vendors, and fake transactions. She disguised personal spending as an operational expense. The total proven theft is $297,473.30, likely only part of the real losses. Now that we've broken down what happened, let's get a deeper dive into who Deidre Johnson actually is and the history behind her corruption. Because this didn't come out of nowhere, and corruption this organized doesn't just pop up overnight. It grows over time inside a system that lets it happen. Johnson wasn't just a random employee at the Killeen Housing Authority. She was a long-term insider in the world of public housing administration. She held the highest authority at KHA, the executive director seat, which means she spent years learning how HUD funding flows, how vendor payments work, and how grant allocations get approved, and exactly where the oversight weaknesses were. This is important because the fraud she committed required insider knowledge. It requires someone who understood how to approve payments, disguise expenses, push invoices through, and bypass accountability systems. This wasn't a smash and grab. This was someone using their position, training, and federal access to housing systems for personal gain. When you look at the timeline, the signs of corruption were there long before federal agents stepped in. Investigators uncovered a pattern of personal payments, repeated unauthorized expenses, falsified vendor invoices, kickback-style transactions, and payments benefiting family members. These weren't one-time slip-ups. This was a repeated, consistent, structured misconduct. Anytime you see purchases of personal furniture, airline tickets, vehicle expenses, and rent payments disguised as housing-related costs, that tells you Johnson wasn't just misusing funds. She was manipulating the system with intent. So what stands out the most about this is how long this went on before anyone caught it. This tells you something bigger. Johnson learned early that there was almost no financial oversight in the KHA. No strong audits, no double verification, no accountability. When someone gets away with the first personal charge, then the second, then the third, corruption grows, fraud becomes routine, and that's when a person realizes the system isn't watching me. I can do whatever I want. And the tragedy is that every time she took even a dollar, a family fell further down the waiting list. One of the clearest indicators of a long-term pattern is the part that nobody talks about. After leaving Killeen in 2022, Johnson didn't disappear. She didn't step away from the public service. She didn't exit the housing field. She was hired directly into another housing role in Austin as a Section 8 project coordinator. Think about that. A person already under suspicion walks straight into another government office handling the same type of federal money she was abusing. That means her behavior in Killeen wasn't detected early enough to stop her career progression of corruption. And that is a systematic failure, not just a personal one. Now, this was a pattern of misconduct. Based on what investigators found, Johnson's corruption followed a very clear pattern. First, there was small personal transactions disguised as business expenses. Then there was larger purchases, furniture, home expenses, services, all the above. After that follow vehicle payments and maintenance using federal funds. Then here comes the luxury expenses, like a first-class flight. Finally, we have kickbacks through fake vendor invoices. This is the same pattern seen in major corruption cases nationwide. People start small, then they grow bolder, then they test the limits. Then they fully exploit the system. By the time investigators stepped in, she was nearly $300,000 deep into fraud. And let's be honest, that number only reflects what investigators could absolutely prove, meaning she probably took a little bit more. This is where the story becomes personal and painful. Johnson wasn't stealing from a bank, a corporation, or some faceless institution. She was stealing from single mothers, elderly residents on fixed incomes, disabled families, homeless individuals, struggling workers, and people already fighting to survive. She stole from people who had no backup plan, the people who needed the housing authority to function. These people relied on those funds just to live. Johnson's story isn't just about one person's criminal behavior. It's a warning about what happens when public agencies fail to enforce oversight. The Killeen Housing Authority didn't collapse overnight. It fell under years of bad leadership, weak auditing, and unchecked authority. Johnson simply took advantage of every weakness she could find. Her case isn't just a scandal, it's a lesson for every taxpayer, every community relying on public housing systems. So when we talk about the nearly 300,000 that vanished, we're not just talking about dollars. We're talking about a trail of corruption built on opportunity, access, and a system that failed the very people in it. Let's continue breaking this down. FBI agent Alex Duran said critical funds meant for vulnerable households were diverted for personal use. Agencies involved included HUD, OIG, FBI San Antonio, and the Texas DPS. So how does this impact our community of Killeen? The Moss Rose Community Center closed in 2023 and was considered for sale in 2024. Vendors went unpaid, delaying repairs, emergency housing was slowed dramatically, and Killeen residents experienced increased homelessness. More families were unable to secure a stable housing due to funding shortages. There was a delayed voucher processing, meaning that families waited for months for services that typically were completed within weeks. There was reduced access to senior and homelessness services. Support programs were crippled due to missing funds. So what did the city do to intervene? Killeen was forced to absorb displaced residents and reestablish emergency housing infrastructure. So why is that important though? Oversight systems failed. Hiring process across agencies lack communication. Taxpayers lose when fraud occurs. There were funding cuts. This means that the future HUD allocations may be reduced after fraud cases, as well as those program losses. Services shut down when the funds were missing. Also, housing shortages. Fewer resources for vulnerable families, increased city expenses, and the local government must fill the gaps left behind by the management. This case demonstrates the urgent need for stronger audits, transparency, and accountability in public housing system. Comment your thoughts below. Does Killeen need stronger oversight? Hit a like, subscribe, and remember, if you want to hear more news about Killeen and your community, go ahead and send me an email at unfilteredlogic.jnew at gmail.com, and we'll do a nice big deep dive like we did today. Stay informed, stay sharp, stay real, and stay logical.
Ain't no capping in my logic, this that real tall vibe. From the south where the grind don't die, we survive. Mind sharp, money right. Truth be the topic. Welcome to the game. This unfiltered logic. Ain't no sugarcoating here, just truth in the topic. Speak facts, not feelings, that's unfiltered logic. Pain made the hustle made profit. I learned from the struggle, now I profit off logic.